Sorry for the technical glitches. Good morning. My name is Blaine Parker. I'm a invasive species coordinator for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Intertribal Fish Commission is a technical and policy advisory group for the 4 Columbia Basin Treaty Tribes: the Nez Perce Tribe, the Yakima Nation, Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So today I'm going to be talking about priority species in the Columbia River Basin. So first of all, quick background on the Columbia River Basin. Most of you guys are probably very intimately familiar with it, but it's the largest river system after the Mississippi River. Historically, it hosted the world's largest salmon and steelhead runs, tens of millions of fish historically. But the interesting aspect is this native fish community actually is a very young fish assemblage compared to, say, streams back east. There was only 34 native species in the Columbia River system prior to European influences. Today, the river now has over 45 species, non-native species in it, of fishes, and it's no longer a free-flowing river. It has been converted as reservoirs stretching from Canada down into the U.S., clear to the ocean by 14 main stem dams. And in addition to the plethora of non-native fishes, there's also dozens of non-native macrophytes and invertebrates found throughout the Columbia River. So a little background on what's an invasive species? We've been talking about it, but I don't recall anybody's actually defined it. So the way it's been defined by a number of authors and a number of writers, but generally speaking, they're not endemic to the area in which they become invasive. They've come from another country, they've come from another habitat, and they tend to negatively impact the habitat and or the inhabitants within that new habitat that they've been introduced to or they've colonized. And sometimes these impacts are not readily apparent. For those of you following the invasive mussels, quagga mussels were probably in Lake Mead for up to 3 years before they even found them. They didn't know they were there. Many other species will be dormant for years or even decades in a system as a new inhabitant, but until the conditions or their numbers actually favor an expansion to where they're noticed. Kind of like the earlier talk that talked about the June beetle. They were there, or the Japanese beetle, excuse me, and all of a sudden they found thousands of them, and they'd only seen a couple of outliers in their traps. So just because they're not in large numbers doesn't mean they're not there. So today I'm going to look at what our priority species are for the Columbia River Basin for aquatic invasives. And I've picked 4 today, given we don't have a lot of time, and I want to focus on what we consider to be the worst case offenders. We have dresidid mussels. That's the collective name for quagga and zebra mussels, shown in the photo up there. Flowering rush, the pretty plant picture there with the water behind it. Northern pike, the lower right picture. And finally, viral hemorrhagic septicemia, VHS, and it's not the tape, it's real. I've put asterisks next to flowering rush and northern pike because they're actually established in portions of the Columbia River Basin, but have not fully invaded the entire basin, and we're hoping to keep it that way. So a little background on dresidid mussels. As I mentioned earlier, we have quagga and zebra mussels. They're actually native to the Black Caspian and Caspian Sea regions in Russia and Eastern Europe. They were introduced, we think, to the Great Lakes in the early 1980s via shipping, inter country shipping from Europe through the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the Great Lakes. And they were likely there for a number of years before they were finally found to be present. But once there, they spread rather quickly, and they have actually colonized a fair portion of the United States, but not all of it. And I'll show you a map here in a second to give you a little more background on that. They're pretty dynamic creatures in the sense of what they're able to do. They're not very large. Most of them aren't much bigger than your thumbnail, but one of those little mussels can filter 1 liter of water a day. And then if you factor in the overall density of them, there's places in the Great Lakes that upwards of 700,000 mussels per square meter. I mean, they are just packed. And they're basically found from the greatest depths to the shorelines. They have direct impacts to native fauna, as you can see in these illustrations or these pictures. That is a crayfish at the lower right, and the mussels are so thick in the water there that these juveniles have colonized a crayfish to the point it could probably not even move. And until it sheds its exoskeleton, it might not even be able to shed it. A large native freshwater clam here, the part that is covered with mussels is the part that's actually exposed from the substrate. Most of the time, a very large portion of that mussel is under the gravels, but what was exposed is covered and likely will seal that clam shut, thus killing it. And they also, on a larger scale, disrupt, with their filtering ability, disrupt ecological processes, increase aquatic plant growth. Places in Lake Erie prior to quagga mussels and zebra mussels colonizing that lake, you couldn't see more than a couple of feet deep on most days in that water in Lake Erie. Now you can see over 60 feet deep. So it allows light transmission, which increases large growth of aquatic plants. Quagga and zebra mussels have the ability to selectively filter their food. So if there's blue-green algae, they don't eat it. They spit it back out, and they will keep the palatable phyto and zooplankton. But what happens is pretty soon you have nothing but toxic algae blooms, or toxic algae, which leads to toxic algae blooms. And then, of course, the masses of aquatic plants die off, and then you end up having an anoxic zone. So that upper right photograph, all that light fluorescent green, those are blue-green algae blooms extending around about half of the lake there. And it's a huge problem up there because these will actually contaminate municipal water sources with toxins. So, and of course, it gets worse every year up there. So yeah, the Great Lakes have undergone a tremendous perturbation from mussels. As I mentioned earlier, here's a map. It's a little out of focus. We just kind of grabbed it off the screen. This is done by USGS, and this is, I think, current through early of this year. The green dots are sightings of zebra mussels and known sites. The yellow or kind of orange is quagga mussels. And what's very interesting, that's what's colonized the lower Colorado system, or quagga mussels. But what's interesting is if you look in the Great Lakes region, you can actually see the outline of Lake Michigan and Huron and part of Erie. And that is because quagga mussels showed up after zebra mussels, but are more effective and outcompete zebra mussels. And essentially, zebra mussels are functionally extinct in most of the Great Lakes. They're almost all quagga mussels now. The invader has been displaced by another invader. And what we're doing to protect the Columbia River Basin, as I mentioned earlier, the Columbia River Basin has not been colonized at this point by quagga or zebra mussels. And that's due in large part to the efforts of the states, particularly Idaho and Montana, Oregon, Washington, and others, with monitoring and check stations that they have on all the major routes. And we spent many years working to perfect those locations so that all incoming boat traffic must stop and be inspected, and if necessary, cleaned or impounded. If they're not able to impound them, they pass them through, but they also notify the states and Canadian provinces that they're coming. And that has probably saved the basin from being actually colonized at this point. Primarily, we're looking at boats that owners winter in the Southwest and Lake Mead, the lower Colorado system, and end up coming back and may actually have live mussels within their water systems or down inside of their motors if they actually moor their boats for a while. And during the summertime, we've got a lot of movement east and west. And then, of course, the mussel states from the east can, recreationists can come out and have boats. And the other big element that we look for, the vector, is commercial boat transport by commercial haulers. And there's been a tremendous amount of work done to reach those folks as well. In addition, the basin has hundreds of monitoring sites that are manned by the public, as well as 8 state and federal agencies and tribes. There's rapid response plans on file with memorandums of agreement, so that if we do end up having mussels found, we can potentially surround that area, surround in the sense that we can block it off and potentially eradicate the mussels in that area if it's in a marina or a boat basin. And as always, there's a multitude of outreach and education opportunities and material that are disseminated through the region annually, particularly since there's always new people coming into the boating and outdoor recreational pursuits that have not been exposed to the literature in the past. And overall, our mantra is clean, drain, and dry. If the boat is cleaned, it's drained, and it's dry, it cannot transport aquatic invasive species. There's no habitat. If you don't, you are at risk for moving all sorts of critters within the waters on your boat or your other watercraft. Moving to northern pike, also known as the water wolf. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the two species, priority species I'm talking about that actually is established in the Columbia River Basin. It is established upstream of Grand Coulee Reservoir, the uppermost dam on the Columbia within the U.S. At this point in time, it has not been detected in the anadromous zone downstream. We have a couple of reports, but they've not been verified at this point. We also have very active monitoring efforts downstream to continue to look for pike throughout the lower system. Northern pike are a very predatory fish, even from a very small size. The upper photo, if you notice just to the right of the fish, there's a bit of white. That's a knife, a standard fishing knife. That pike is only about 10 to 12 inches long, and it's got a stomach full of baby sockeye salmon. That was a pike that was removed in Alaska in an area where they weren't found naturally.
Blaine, you have about 3.5 minutes left.
All righty, good. We'll move it along. They can eat food up to more than half their body length and are a voracious predator on other fishes. Management of pike has been primarily done through targeted spring and summer gill netting in the Lake Roosevelt system and Pend Oreille rivers. And between the states and the tribes in that region, they've removed tens of thousands of pike since 2014, which has greatly brought the densities down from the highs of the pre-management levels. Invasive species management, particularly in aquatic systems, is often like mowing the lawn. If you forget to do it for a while, you'll be like this gentleman here and you'll be back to where you started. So it takes a constant, regular management action to keep those species down. You're not going to eradicate them in all sense of the word, but you can keep them to a background level. Flowering rush is an aquatic engineer. It is not native, but was brought in as an ornamental garden plant and has now escaped through large portions of the United States, particularly in the Great Lakes region, also in the West. It's been out west for probably 50 or 60 years. It's a very generalist plant, can occupy shallow waters up to depths of almost 20 feet. The stands decrease water flow, increase water temperatures, and change nutrient cycling. There's 7 genotypes. Ours is dominated by a triploid variety that is found kind of exclusively in the West. The last one I want to talk about is viral hemorrhagic septicemia. We're not currently monitoring for this. We're hopefully that it doesn't come out here. But again, movement of fresh live fish in a live well could bring it here. It is primarily known in Europe and the Great Lakes. Europe's been battling it for many years in their hatcheries. It actually was documented in the U.S. for the first time in Pacific salmon that were returning to the Puget Sound region. That's a marine portion of that virus. But there is a strain called 4B, which is most prevalent in the Great Lakes, which has been known since 2005 and has killed literally millions of fish of up to 25 different species. And this would be devastating to have in the Columbia as well. But we're not, the only way we'd know it is we started finding dead fish with the spots on the body. But we're, obviously people would be looking for it if something like that happened. And just to kind of wrap up looking at the future, as you've heard today, invasive species are something that's in our foreseeable future. They're not going away. And of course, as Justin mentioned, that we are the enemy in the sense that we're the people, the human population moves these things around, buys them, sells them, transports them knowingly or unknowingly. And it's up to us and to increase the awareness of user groups and the general public to combat the movement of non-native invasive species in the aquatic sectors. And we will continue to need increased outreach and education and have greater flexibility with rapid response when and if necessary. And that's my talk. Any questions? can stay for a few minutes. Thank you. I'll switch my screen back off.